Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, April 11th. This week, we're tracking a troubling new phase in the pressure on access and privacy rights across Canada. In British Columbia, the provincial government has confirmed it is now using artificial intelligence tools in freedom of information processing, even as concerns grow about transparency, accountability, and the lack of a clear public framework. We'll also look at how FIPA brought those broader concerns to the Privacy and Access Council of Canada this week, as the pattern of so-called modernization continues to narrow access rights in multiple provinces. Elsewhere, Ontario's government is facing backlash after sweeping budget legislation that would retroactively shield political records from Freedom of Information law. While in Alberta, access-obtained documents raise fresh concerns about ideological influence over public education. And internationally, the pressure is rising on big tech, as courts and governments take a much harder line on youth social media harms and platform accountability. Let's dive in. We begin with our network updates in British Columbia, where the Tyee reports the provincial government has started using AI tools in freedom of information processing in the name of efficiency. The Ministry of Citizen Services says the tools are being used for limited support functions like reviewing handwritten records and identifying personal information for redaction. But the deeper concern is not just what the tools are doing now, it is what comes next. FIPA President Mike Larson and Executive Director Jason Waiwata were both interviewed as part of the article. In it, they warn that once AI becomes normalized in one jurisdiction, it can spread quickly across the country, even without a proper public policy framework in place. FIPA also recognizes that personal information can be hard to remove from AI, and people no longer have total control of the information once in those systems. Staying in BC, this week FIPA Executive Director Jason Waiwata joined the Privacy and Access Council of Canada's Wisdom Wednesday webinar to make exactly that broader point. In remarks prepared for the discussion, FIPA highlights that access systems across Canada are increasingly being reshaped under the language of modernization, efficiency, and system strain. But too often the practical result is weaker rights, broader discretion to refuse requests, and a growing shift away from openness. Bill 9 in British Columbia was a central example, but not the only one, and there is continued discussion on the impacts that bill creates. Rob Shaw reports that the EB government has now tabled additional legislation that would let ministers personally certify which cabinet records are off-limits during judicial reviews. Critics say that would expand secrecy protections and let government rewrite the rules after court losses, pointing to two bills in one session to override judges and two high-profile appeals. Coming on top of Bill 9 and other spring legislation, it adds to the picture of a government increasingly willing to respond to scrutiny by tightening control and reducing access. And finally, in this segment, the battle over lawful access and privacy is now shaping up again in Ottawa. The International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is warning that Bill C-22 would massively expand surveillance powers by forcing electronic service providers to redesign their systems for easier access by police and CSIS, while also allowing metadata retention for up to a year. CBC reports that even the government does not yet know what the cost will be, though industry says the burden could be enormous. A similar lawful access bill was pushed by Conservatives in 2012 and was pegged at $80 million. Others think the cost of this would be greater. For civil liberties advocates, the core issue is familiar. Once again, privacy rights are being asked to give way in the name of efficiency, security, and investigative convenience. Government across Canada is currently putting in place laws to reduce the public's right to access information while simultaneously increasing their own ability to collect personal information from people for police enforcement and government agencies without oversight and authorization. Now to access to information stories from across Canada and outside BC. Ontario remains the clearest flashpoint this week. The Canadian Press reports that Doug Ford's latest omnibus budget bill would retroactively shield the Premier, cabinet ministers, and their offices from Ontario's Freedom of Information law. Opposition parties say the government may try to fast-track the bill, limiting scrutiny of sweeping changes buried inside a budget package. Ford's progressive conservatives have a history of sitting in the legislature for fewer days a year than previous governments, as well as using their large majority in the House to limit debate and, in several cases, skip the committee stage altogether. And because the change appears designed in part to kill existing requests, including for Ford's cell phone records, which Ford has admitted is part of the rationale for the changes, the fight is not just about future secrecy, but about shutting down accountability already underway. LGI reporter Joshua Drakes at the Orangeville Citizen reports that anti-Ford demonstrators gathered in downtown Orangeville to protest what they see as a growing pattern of provincial unaccountability. Although people were there to protest different things, they decided to pool their efforts into one larger movement to hopefully increase their visibility. Among the issues raised were healthcare, education, environmental policy, and the proposed FOI changes that would make ministerial records secret. The protest was one of many across Ontario, reflecting how access to information concerns are now merging with wider frustrations about democratic accountability. Meanwhile, the Canadian press reports that Ontario's autism program is now approaching $1 billion in annual spending, but advocates say Freedom of Information figures still show demand outpacing access to care. Families are reportedly waiting about 5 years for core services, and critics say the government must do more than inject money. It must actually redesign the system so children can get timely support. Advocates have also been calling for non-monetary ways to make the program more efficient, including simplifying an annual determination of needs process. LGI reporter Kimberly DeJong at the Brant Beacon reports that a similar Fight Ford protest took place in Brantford and 29 other municipalities, where demonstrators again linked healthcare, OSAP cuts, environmental policy, and freedom of information changes into one broader critique of the government. One protester described the proposed FOI amendments as her end of the line, arguing that transparent government is inseparable from the province's ability to respond fairly on every other issue. LGI reporter Anushka Yadav at The Pointer reports that Ontario's new budget doubles down on highways, fossil fuel dependence, and sprawl, while saying little about climate adaptation, even as wildfire and flood risks intensify. But from an access perspective, the story also points to something else. The province is still fighting to keep politically sensitive records secret, including documents tied to Highway 413. Despite a 2024 order from the Information and Privacy Commissioner directing the release of the requested documents, the province has refused and is pursuing a judicial review. The Pointer is also waiting on a decision about documents requested from Ottawa regarding Highway 413. So even as massive infrastructure choices are being made, the government is also moving to reduce the public's ability to see the records behind them. And also from The Pointer, LGI reporter Ed Smith and Joel Whitnebel report that David Barrick is out of his latest municipal CAO role after less than 3 months. This is just weeks after Smith was blocked by OPP officers from attending a public council meeting while reporting on Barrick's history of political scandals. The case now raises larger questions about municipal transparency, press freedom, and whether law enforcement was improperly used to keep a journalist away from public proceedings. The Pointer continues to investigate how Barrick was hired in Thames Centre and South Stormont, and why he no longer has a job. Moving west, LGI reporter Brett McKay at the Investigative Journalism Foundation reports that access-obtained documents show Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Education Minister Dimitrios Nicolaides held a private meeting with groups linked to efforts to, quote, conservatize school boards and push book bans affecting LGBTQ content. The names of individuals at the meeting were redacted under Section 20 of Alberta's Access to Information Act, which says that disclosure could be harmful to personal privacy. However, the names of the organizations they represented were disclosed. Critics say the meeting raises serious questions about ideological influence over public education policy, especially when the groups involved have already been connected to campaigns targeting diversity and inclusion in schools. And in Alberta more broadly, The Canadian Press reports that the province has introduced legislation aimed at limiting children's access to sexually explicit images in public libraries. The bill aims to make sure children ages 15 and under can't access visual depictions of sex by placing these books behind a desk. The government says the move is about age-appropriate safeguards, not censorship. Opposition says librarians are professionals and are ensuring that kids are signing out age-appropriate material, but library advocates say they were not properly consulted, and critics argue the province is once again using broad political intervention in a sector that depends on professional judgment and public trust. Back at the national level, the Canadian Press reports that Access-obtained records show nearly a third of police investigations involving members of foreign diplomatic missions in Canada ended with the subject leaving the country before charges were laid or proceedings concluded. Documents obtained by the Canadian Press through an Access to Information request list 67 incidents involving members of foreign missions that required police involvement between September 1, 2020 and December 31, 2025, with 22 of those subjects fleeing the country before charges could be laid. The cases include impaired driving, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other serious allegations. The records point to a persistent accountability gap whenever diplomatic status intersects with criminal investigations. And in one of the week's most significant historic access stories, LGI reporter Jacqueline St. Pierre at the Manitoulin Expositor reports that newly declassified RCMP Security Service files confirm extensive surveillance and infiltration of Indigenous political movements during the Cold War era. The nearly 6,000 pages of records show monitoring far beyond any credible threat of violence, extending into land claims, governance, and lawful political advocacy. Not only Indigenous people were targeted, though. Many LGBTQ people were also surveilled, interrogated, and removed from military and public services during a time frame that has come to be known as the LGBT Purge. The reporting makes clear that access to historical records is not only about the past, it is often the only way to expose the true scale of state power. And finally, in this segment, LGI reporter John Worth at Alberta Native News reports on a forensic audit that found $28.7 million in unsupported or ineligible expenses at the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, or FSIN. To address the unaccounted $28.7 million in public tax dollars, Chief of the SFIN held an exclusive news conference to justify the spending before an exclusive audience of merely 2 news outlets. This effectively shielded themselves from the broader scrutiny of the provincial and national media corporations at a critical moment that demanded maximum transparency. The dispute has opened a major debate over oversight, transparency, and governance, with internal critics arguing that public money cannot be defended by broad appeals to good intentions where documentation and accountability are missing. Now to privacy and cybersecurity stories from across Canada. In Quebec, Erica Morris reports that the Superior Court has authorized a class action against Uber and their food delivery service over cancellation fees. The argument is straightforward. Quebec consumer law requires charges to be clearly disclosed in contracts and terms of service, and the plaintiffs say Uber's language that fees may be charged is not specific enough. Uber denied the allegations and told the Canadian Press, quote, "Cancellation fees are clearly disclosed to users within the app before they proceed with the cancellation," end quote. At stake is not just a few dollars per ride, but whether digital platforms can continue to rely on vague disclosures while still accessing users' payment information. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the Canadian Press reports that about 250 doctors are warning of a possible physician exodus if a new electronic health information system goes live as a mandatory requirement. Doctors say the Core Care Agreement exposes them to open-ended liability tied to breach investigations and other compliance risks. The contract says doctors must cover their costs, including legal costs, to cooperate in any investigations into data breaches, whether they were at fault or not. It then goes on to say that they must also cover the health authority's costs if a breach is found to be the result of the physician's, quote, negligence, misconduct, or contractual non-compliance, end quote. In a province already short on family doctors, the privacy and governance structure of a digital system is no longer a technical detail. It is becoming a system-wide stability issue. In Nova Scotia, the new CEO of Nova Scotia Power says the utility is trying to rebuild trust after last year's cyber attack. The company says it has now reconnected smart meter systems and deleted all customer social insurance numbers from its files, following commitments made to the Federal Privacy Commissioner. The utility says it has beefed up its cybersecurity with system enhancements, more training and education, and heightened awareness of world events that might trigger an attack. But after the personal data of 280,000 customers was accessed, the company still faces a long road in restoring public confidence. In Ontario, the Canadian Press reports that lawyers for Toronto Constable Timothy Barnhart, who is facing 17 charges, are seeking a review of a bail ruling after he was denied release in a major corruption probe. Investigators allege Barnhart leaked personal information to a key figure in a criminal network. The case has already shaken public trust in policing because when officers are accused of trafficking in confidential information, the damage goes well beyond a single prosecution. 18 other suspects were arrested in the investigation, including 2 youths. Back in British Columbia, LGI reporter Michelle Gamage at the Tyee reports on sharp criticism of an RCMP sting operation targeting sex buyers. Police say the operation was intended to disrupt trafficking-related demand. But sex worker advocates and researchers argue the tactic makes sex work more dangerous by making those who have been trafficked less likely to talk to police, pushes activity further underground, and blurs the line between trafficking and consensual adult sex work. From a privacy and harm reduction perspective, the story is also about surveillance, who is watched, how they are categorized, and whether state intervention is actually making vulnerable people safer. And federally, Jim Bronskill reports that Ottawa has released a policy paper proposing major changes to the Privacy Act. The government wants to make it easier for federal institutions to reuse and share personal information across departments and with provincial, territorial, and municipal partners without consent, so long as the purpose is tied to service delivery. Officials say stronger notice requirements and transparency tools would offset that change. They even suggest bolstering protection by recognizing privacy as a fundamental right and requiring what's known as a privacy impact assessment when a federal program uses personal data to make a decision about someone. But the proposal would still mark a major shift in how government treats personal information, from data collected for one purpose to data increasingly available for many. Now to international stories, where the pressure on big tech and youth digital safety is intensifying on multiple fronts at once. In the United States, juries in both California and New Mexico have now found that major platforms, including Meta and YouTube, can be held liable for harms to children. That is a significant shift. For years, tech companies argued that the harms linked to social media were incidental, difficult to prove, or protected by the legal shields that govern user content. But these cases focused instead on design, addiction, and product choices. And as we face a turning point for social media, AI is already becoming the next frontier in the fight to make technology safer for young people. At the same time, governments outside the United States are moving faster than Washington to impose direct restrictions. Indonesia has begun implementing a ban on high-risk social media accounts for children under 16. Australia already moved in that direction, but this makes Indonesia the first country in Southeast Asia to implement a social media ban. Brazil now requires parental supervision and limits addictive design features like infinite scroll. And across Europe, governments and regulators are tightening age assurance rules, with the European Union now investigating Snapchat over child safety and accusing major porn platforms of failing to keep minors out. Taken together, these developments suggest a broader turning point. Courts are becoming less willing to treat platform harms as unfortunate side effects, and governments are becoming less willing to accept self-regulation as enough. The core debate is no longer whether youth digital harms are real. It is who will bear responsibility for addressing them. Families, schools, governments, or the companies whose business models help create the problem in the first place. Before we go, a story from Cochrane, Ontario, that speaks directly to why information management matters. LGI reporter Marissa Lentz-McGrath at Timmins Today reports that a third-party audit found serious confidentiality and records management failures inside the municipality. Investigators identified unauthorized access to closed meeting records, improper sharing of legally privileged information, weak controls over sensitive records, and 362 emails that were potentially in breach of municipal policy. Some records were forwarded to personal email accounts. Others were handled through outdated systems and poorly understood procedures. Investigators also noted the town relies on a single IT staff member and that some physical records are stored in the basement of Town Hall, highlighting additional challenges in managing records securely. The municipality says senior staff involved are no longer there, and that reforms are now underway. From FIPA's perspective, this is exactly why information governance cannot be relegated and denigrated as back-office administrative housekeeping. When records are poorly managed, confidentiality is breached, legal risks rises, and public trust collapses. When routine controls fail badly enough, a formal audit may feel extreme, but it can also be the necessary step to reestablish accountability. Public bodies do not rebuild trust by asking for patience alone. They rebuild it by proving that records, access, and confidentiality are being taken seriously. That is all for this week. Thank you for listening and for staying engaged with the issues that shape privacy, information management, and public transparency in Canada and beyond. Please subscribe through FIPA's news monitoring service, and if you're able, consider supporting this work with a donation. It helps us keep bringing these stories to you each week. Our writer Sean Fisk. Original music in today's show was composed by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, your host and producer. Thank you for joining. And a big FIPA thank you to all the reporters, contributors, and outlets whose work makes this podcast possible, and to you, our listeners, for continuing to support it. Stay safe and stay informed.